I think coming to that medium and saying, I'm going to let myself be immersed in this world that's laid out before me. Whether or not I believe in this, accept it, think it's legitimate, whatever, I'm here for the story.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show.
Ain't no mountain high enough.
I'm Sean.
I'm Jen.
And today we're here with Eden Royce. Welcome to the show, Eden.
Thank you so much for having me.
So excited you're here.
This is exciting. Yeah, we've been waiting. Like, when is Eden's book coming out? When's Eden's book coming out? And then finally Eden's book came out. We're like, all right, interview time. Let's do this.
That's literally how it happens. But we were patient, at least, you know.
We certainly had to with the year we had to wait for this, so...
That was 10,000 years long? Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So, for those that don't know Eden's from Charleston, South Carolina. Very lovely place. As a member of the Gullah Geechee Nation. Also really cool. Her work has appeared in various print and online publications, including 2 short story collections. Holy moly, it's a lot of short stories. And she's a recipient of the Speculative Literature Foundation's Diverse Worlds Grant. And the book we're here to talk about is her debut middle grade novel called Root Magic. So welcome back to the show, Eden, and thank you for bringing this really fantastic book for us to talk about.
It is a pleasure to be here, and I am so delighted that you enjoyed Root Magic.
It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
This is just me making delighted noises over here if you can't hear them.
Delighted squeaks.
Delighted squeaks.
Love delighted squeaks.
Eden, give us the rundown of Root Magic.
Oh, wow. Root Magic is, as you mentioned, it's my debut novel. It is a middle grade novel, meaning that it was written necessarily for ages 8 to 12, but any age group above that can certainly enjoy it. It is a historical Southern Gothic set in South Carolina in 1963, which is one of the years that is just a hotbed of tension, not only in the South, but in the United States, with civil rights movements and assassinations and domestic terrorist attacks, and lots of turmoil going on. And these twins from a small sea island off the coast of South Carolina turn 11 and begin to learn root work, which is their family's ancestral folk magic, to protect themselves, to protect the rest of their family, and to keep themselves safe from haints and spirits and racism and bullying, and just learning about how they're not alone in the world. They have ancestry and they have ties that they didn't even realize that they knew about on their side.
As usual, Eden just answered 5 of my questions.
Glad to help. Well, we can talk later.
We're done now. That was the interview. Just kidding. But first off, and we'll touch on other things that you talked about, obviously, very, very soon. But I couldn't help but notice that this book is about saltwater Geechee versus your specific roots as a freshwater Geechee. So why were the islands a more appropriate setting for the twins and the Turner family?
Well, I'm a freshwater Geechee, meaning that I grew up in the city of Charleston. So I didn't grow up on one of the sea islands. My grandparents did, however. So Root Magic was based on stories that I heard from them. It was based on stories I heard from my mom, who did grow up in the city of Charleston as well. She was a social worker during this time, and a lot of the area that she covered was the Sea Islands. So I wanted to have as much authenticity as I could, taking those stories from my family members and being able to weave a fictional story around real stories. So it was important for me to set it on the Sea Islands because it was where Gullah Geechee was born, essentially. It's the isolation from the rest of the world which allows Gullah Geechee to maintain language and heritage and stories and traditions. So it was really important to set it on the island so that all of those rituals and just the way of life could be brought to the fore.
Absolutely. And it's beautifully done. And it was so nice to see all those cultural touch points within this. Learn about those cultural touch points for me, obviously. So one of the things that you and I have talked about in the past, and you specifically just called this Southern Gothic, but we've talked about sort of the difference between how for cultures like the Gullah Geechee that actively believe in folk magic and the supernatural, the term fantasy doesn't actually apply, which leaves us with something like magical realism as a better descriptor. But you've chosen very specifically to call it Southern Gothic. So, how does it fall within the spectrum of all of those things?
Well, I personally chose Southern Gothic because when I was originally introduced to Gothic literature, originally just Gothic literature, moving into Southern Gothic literature, as I started enjoying stories that had lots of atmosphere, that had this sort of slow, creeping eeriness to them. I loved those elements of story. And I think that that really influenced the way that I write instead of having, I don't know, just people think of horror as some sort of person chasing you through a campground with a massive knife. And they don't necessarily always think of quieter horror and chills or anything that's a little bit of a slower paced, like Gothic. And I've always considered my work to be not only set in the South, but really atmospheric and taking a lot of the tenets of what Southernism is, and by extension, what Gullah Geechee is and what Southern Blackness is, and putting those into my work. And I felt like I do take those tenets of the Gothic and put it in a Southern setting, and that's in its simplest form what Southern Gothic is. And I don't necessarily make up a lot of different worlds or create a planet to set things on or anything like that, or create a different fantasy world to set my stories in. So I typically wouldn't consider a lot of what I write necessarily fantasy because it's happening in a real world setting. It just happens to have magical elements that are actually practiced in real life. So when you look at Southern Gothic as a genre, when it includes things like ghosts and spirits and all of that, they don't consider it to be fantasy. They consider it to be showing a world that has characters that believe in the existence of ghosts and the supernatural. So that's why I decided that Southern Gothic really was the best fit for my work.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting thing that the term magical realism gets used a lot to refer to works that, like, they have, and I'm using quotation marks, which everyone on the call can see, but nobody in the real world can, but like, they have fantastical elements to them. You know, they're fantasies, but only in the sense that people who aren't from those cultures maybe don't share a belief in those things, or even are not necessarily presented to us as though they're like these physical entities that we're interacting with, but there are cultures that, as you were kind of describing, that they do interact with them, and so we're left with this odd position, which is, if we were to flip the script, right, if we were to take this and say, like, a Catholic, for example, who feels very strongly in the existence of Jesus and all of these kinds of things, right, from a perspective of somebody who doesn't share those beliefs, those would seem like fantasies as well. So there's like a really, I think it's interesting that you really point out that importance of the perspective, and there's a need to like respect that perspective, that different people have a different view of the world, and it's not as simple to just say that those things aren't real. Well, they kind of are, in a sense, to the people that believe in those things. They are very much real.
Absolutely. And I think that when you come to a piece of fiction, whether it's a film or a book, you have to make a decision. Well, you don't have to, you can do what you want. Um, but it's to get the fullest experience. I think coming to that medium and saying, I'm going to let myself be immersed in this world that's laid out before me. Whether or not I believe in this, accept it, think it's legitimate, whatever, I'm here for the story. I'm here for the experience. And I think that that will increase the enjoyment of whatever that book or movie or short story is for the watcher or for the reader.
Yeah, I thought that that was one of the things that you did incredibly well was create that balance between this clearly being a historical fiction, but also showing how real root magic is, not just to the twins and to their family, but to the world that and the space that they exist in. And obviously, as an extension of that, yourself and Gulagichi as a whole, that it is something that's just woven in to the fabric of their everyday lives. And in root magic, it never seems like fantasy. It always seems like it's just a thing that is. There's nothing weird about it. There's nothing strange. There's nothing even necessarily like magical as a modern white American might think about it. It just is.
Absolutely. And that is what I wanted to portray in the book, that you're getting a glimpse into the lives of these characters. And it's not going to be necessarily portrayed in a fantastical way. I wanted it to be a very slice of life read.
Yeah, I definitely felt that there's this moment very early in the book that I thought was just that it was really interesting because normally, like, when the kids in a book discover quote unquote magic, right? It's like, oh, this whole big amazing world opens up, and it's like, I'm flying on dragons, and like, I'm reading a magic book that never ends, and it's got like, I'm making references for Jen to Never Ending Story, but like it's all these like grand things, and I love like one of the very first introductions for the kids in this is they're painting the house with protection, right? And it's literally like little drops of stuff that's being put into paint, and it's so withdrawn and so simple, and their immediate reaction is kind of like, I thought we were going to do like curses and hexes and like all of these big things, and there's this emphasis on like, no, you have to start with the very passive sort of small things, and these are actually some of the most important elements of how this works. And so there's like this interesting sense of, rather than having the explosion of scale like in like an epic fantasy, right? It's very, in a way, like it feels much more less of an escape and more real, and grounded, if that makes sense. I mean, obviously you're drawing on real cultural elements and real things that do are practiced and are believed in, so that also is helping. But I just love that moment where they're just like, yeah, when are we gonna do the big stuff? And they're like, nah, we got to paint the house with some protection first. Start there.
And I think that's something that can be sort of reinforced to not just kids, but to readers, whether they may be adults, but finding the magic in really simple everyday things, finding and especially now where we are with pandemics and not being able to do a lot of the things that we would like to do, finding magic and enjoyment and in a lot of cases some solace, I guess, in smaller everyday things.
Absolutely. I agree. 100%.
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to switch to slightly, serious is the wrong word, but a little bit harder subject, because one of the interesting things about this book is it has a lot of, on the cusp of things. Things are happening. They're about to happen, or have just happened. So you have the twins, turning 11. You've got a new school year, and there is desegregation of schools has started this process in South Carolina. We've got the civil rights movement. All of this, it's set in 1963, and so there's a lot of change happening, and in some of it not good, and some of it very good, and some of it stressful, right? It's some very tough changes that are happening. And
Don't
so,
don't forget about Gran.
and Graham, I didn't want to talk about Grand dying. Stop it. Uh, right,
It
there is a
happens in the
passing
first
in the
chapter.
first chapter that I'm not ruining anything, but yeah, the grandmother passes away, right, and this is obviously a big moment as well. And so I guess there's sort of two questions to this, and one is like, what interested you about setting this specifically in this cultural and political moment, because it's a pretty big moment in U.S. history. And then I was thinking that the relation of that is the way that you try to parallel some of those wider world issues and how they affect the Turner family on a sort of more personal level. It's kind of a big open-ended question. Maybe start with why is 1963?
Well, as you said, 1963 is it's a huge year, or it was a huge year. So much was changing, so much was happening. Some of it positive, some of it not so positive. It brings to mind something that a friend of a friend told me a very, very long time ago that has always stuck with me, and that is that even positive change requires adjustment. And this particular year and most of Root Magic is a book of adjustment. So there are good things happening, but there are bad things happening. But throughout the entire book, the characters, all of them they're adjusting. And sometimes they do it well, and sometimes they're struggling to do it. But I wanted it to really parallel a lot of what people are still facing today, and sometimes setting a book historically so that people can see that these issues are persistent. Because I think a lot of times people think that we're past it. The the civil rights movement, that was years ago, decades ago. We are far beyond that now. And some recent events have shown that we aren't as far beyond those occurrences as maybe people would like to think. And sometimes writing something that's a historical work that people then read in a modern setting helps people make that connection and helps people understand why change is still needed and why adjustments still need to be made. I think another reason is 1963. In talking with my mother, I was able to really sort of pin down lots of things about that time frame, not just from a socio-political point of view, but also from, you look at just as teachers, Miss Watson. I was able to talk to my mom about what was the fashion at that time. So you see Miss Watson, and she comes into school and she is dressed in the latest suit, and she wears her gloves and she wears her stockings, and she's different than any other teacher that the twins have had before. And so just all these little details that I think help bring characters to life and help bring the world to life. And I was able to sort of add in a lot of what I knew growing up because my grandparents did it, of ways of cooking and types of food and things that people grew and all of that good stuff. I was able to actually talk to people who are still around, and use that to put into my work. And I think that's a really important thing for people to do is talk to other people who are older to you, elders and family members, to get those real life stories that they may not have ever mentioned to anyone before, certainly haven't written down before, and find a way to keep their stories alive.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were saying this idea about making sure that their stories are told. And there's a point very early in the book where I believe it's the mother says like explicitly of like we have to make sure that our stories are told, that it is not just other people speaking for us, which is why you need to go to school and learn all of these things. It's really important that you can speak. You have the ability to speak. But then on a humorous note, I gotta know there's a scene where they're teasing crabs out of shells.
Hmm.
Was that a thing that you also did? Like were you
Yes.
a crab whisperer?
I did do that when I was little. Going down to the marsh and picking these crabs, and they would hide in these little spiral shells. And in order to get them out, as a kid, you would just sit them against, your neck where your, vocal cords can, they can vibrate, and they will feel the vibration, and they would come out, and you could race them, or whatever it was that you wanted to do, depending on the kid. Trade them. This one's bigger. This shell's different. Da 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 da. So yes, that was something that I did with it as a kid. So
I was gonna say though, bonus points here. All of these adjustments that are happening, and all the characters adjusting, is the same process that middle grade readers are going through, which is one of like it makes Root Magic as a story such a perfect sort of introduction to young readers of they're going through some stuff clearly, and or they're going to be going through some stuff, and that's okay. You will learn to deal with those adjustments, and every one of you will deal with it in a different way, and some of it might not be the greatest way, and some of it's going to be a much better way, but it's going to happen. So that was a really, for me, that was a really nice like thing to see. And I loved that part of that for you was showing the difference between how Jezebel reacts to Root Magic and how Jay reacts to Root Magic, very particularly. You know, he's the one that's going, it's so fun! Let's do the big stuff! And though Jezebel definitely has some more selfish desires, in terms of how she wants to use Root Magic, she still wants to study it very seriously and is taking it seriously, whereas Jay Moore is like, let's go do some big stuff.
Exactly.
Let's have fun with this.
And I definitely wanted to contrast them because Jay's friends have a tendency to think, yeah, it's really cool that you do that. And so he's coming at it from, yeah, I want to learn this, but I kind of maybe want to learn it so I can do some cool stuff in front of my friends. And Jez is in a different space than that. And she's a bit more introspective, even at her age. And she recognizes the importance of all of these things around her, societal changes, and that she isn't as well liked as her brother, and that there are just some certain responsibilities that not only her family may place on her, but she just, sort of takes on her own shoulders.
Absolutely. So this kind of goes to my next question, so I'm going to awkwardly transition to it. One of the things that's really central to Root Magic is the bond that the Turner family has to each other and ultimately to their roots. But particularly, as we were just discussing, the bond between Jezebel and Jay and how that bond is ultimately tested. It's a new school year, they're in whole different grades, and I think for the first time they're in different classes. They're at that point in their life where they're making a huge transition. It's not just a small one. This is a big transition for each of them. Why was it so important for you to explore that aspect of their relationship and further to explore how Jezebel specifically is learning how to be on her own?
I think that I won't say that it's only from a kid perspective, but a lot of times, even as adults, some of the scariest things in the world are because we're facing them on our own. And if we were able to walk into a new classroom, but we had our brother with us, who's been with us for as long as we can remember, who we have some confidence that that other person has our back, it makes it a little bit easier. And I wanted to bring in ancestry and the fact that you have built-in support because of that. So I wanted to separate the kids in a way that seemed logical. And an early reader of Root Magic, who happens to have twins, when he responded, said this is one of his biggest fears for his kids, that one of them will progress a bit faster or further in schooling than the other one. And I wanted that to be something that was an extra sort of separation of, you will have these times where you will be by yourself and moving through a space where you're not really sure that the other kids like you all that much, you're the weird kid, etc., etc. And that's a tough thing for kids to deal with. And they're going through school, and on top of schoolwork and trying to get things done and everything else going on in life, going on in the world around them. On top of that, you've got kids that don't really know you, but have made a decision about you, what kind of kid you are, what kind of person you are. and treat you that way, regardless of whether they're right about it. And I wanted her to have to realize that she can do her best to operate outside of what people think about her. Because that's one of the hardest things we have to do as individuals living in a society is operate outside of what other people think of us and think about what we are and what we do, and still be able to carry on with what our to-do list is for that day. And I wanted her to learn a little bit earlier, possibly a little bit earlier than some of us have in our lives, that you can operate outside of what people think about you and be okay.
The individuality I think is interesting too because with Jezebel and when she's learning root magic and she's learning some of these things and some about the world and the other beings that exist in it, as she starts to develop this awareness, she also somewhat differs from her traditional family way of viewing things, specifically her relationship or perspective on a haint that she discovers. She sort of has a very different point of view from the sort of tradition on how her family has practiced this and viewed these things. And I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about why you wanted to explore this tension between the sort of traditional root magic and Jezebel's new way of kind of exploring these things.
I wanted to get into that because it really reflects what root work is today. And people may or may not know that it is a living, growing, magical practice. And people who have embraced learning root work, learning about the other African traditional religions, people that are doing that now are starting to realize that while it's important to learn the history, and while it's important to learn current spells and self care and everything else that root work is, it's also important to learn the origins of root work and learn where it came from, how it got here, why we even know about it. There are some people out in the world who want to strip these magics, whether they're Gullah Geechee magics or native magics or indigenous magics, and just use the parts that appeal to them and use the parts that they think are interesting or cool and package it up in some glitzy way. I appreciate what people who are, especially some of the Black people that I know and Black women especially that I know who are learning and embracing root work and digging into its origins and all of that are really doing a lot to uncover the history of it as well and make sure that those connections stay strong. And I wanted to bring that out because Jezebel recognizes the importance of root work and she learns about its origins, but there are things that she doesn't agree with. And I think as we grow as people, as society moves on, as time moves on, beliefs in certain things shift and change. And I wanted to get across the realization that because you now have a different view on a certain aspect, it doesn't mean you have to throw away all of the origins of a thing. Because I think sometimes people just say, well, this particular magic has an aspect that I don't agree with. So, I can't be involved in it. And certainly there are people that believe that. But I think that in a lot of ways, learning and taking on a magic that is still growing and changing and using it to further your own knowledge is an important thing to do, and but still recognize the origins of it and how we got here, and not always believe that everything that has very, very ancient roots is necessarily always a bad thing.
There's a part in what you're saying here that I was thinking about this because when I was did a little research and I was because I'm not super familiar with root magic and these kinds of root work, and so I decided to Google and I was curious like kind of information is out there and like when you were talking just a moment ago about like people who want to repackage it and make it glitzy and these kinds of things, one of the very first things I found was a book by like a white woman from Maryland that was like, here's all the hoodoo and like here's all the conjure stuff. And I was like, my first reaction to that was, but like, you have no connection to this culture. You just like run like a mojo shop and like like Boston or something. And it seemed to me that part of what you're talking about here is that, you know, all cultures change and adjust over time, but it's part of being in the process of being in a living culture rather than like I'm just going to repackage things to just fit what I think a thing should be. If that
Right.
makes sense.
Absolutely.
I do want to say that Jen and I had a blast because there is a little bit of Gullah in here, the language, and Jen and I were having a little bit of fun because I shared a link of a fellow by the name of Sun Michaud, I believe is
Hmm.
the pronunciation, and he teaches currently teaches at
At
Harvard
Harvard.
a Gullah language class as
Hmm.
a way of preserving it, and it was really cool because he's got a couple videos where he speaks in Gullah,
Yes.
and it's so cool. Oh my god, this is like it's its own thing. It's like a totally different thing, and I'm utterly fascinated, and I now want to go to Harvard so I can take these classes. I'll never get to go, but gosh darn it.
It's a beautiful language, and it was really nice to see it in this, and that actually relates to my next question and a sort of sub question. So, another tension that you're exploring is not just from between tradition and new ways of doing things, but is also between the Gullah Geechee and other Black Americans, some of whom may actually have Gullah Geechee roots, but they're also caught up in the notion of respectability politics that in order to thrive in America, you have to set aside your own culture and language and traditions. So this plays out in a couple of ways, not just the bullying that Jez has to deal with, but also in terms of the use of Gola, the language. So can you talk about a little bit about this and why you felt that sort of the embracing of culture and also the notion of respectability politics to young readers?
Well, several reasons, really. One of which is because it's still a tension that's happening now. Young Geechee people are still targeted, are still considered uneducated or undereducated because of the way that they speak. There are still teachers and educators that hear Geechee people speak, whether they speak Gullah, whether they speak Geechee, and feel like it's an impediment to their being able to learn. And it puts them in a category of people seeing them as on a lower rung. So when these people who tend to speak Geechee most of the time, when they run into teachers that don't understand, or they run into the police, or they run into people who would be hiring them for jobs, there is a discrimination that still exists because there is that association that if you speak Geechee, then that means that you are of a lower echelon. And I still wanted to address that because I wanted young Geechee speakers to realize that speak your language. If you want to preserve a thing, it has to be practiced, it has to be spoken, it has to be shared. All these languages and cultural items will be lost if, for whatever reason, they aren't continued or aren't continually in practice. And it's an effort to sort of chip away at that belief that people that speak Gullah and people that speak Geechee, which, as you said, is an actual language, it's an African patois. And I think to a certain extent, on a larger scale, when you watch movies and you read books, you sometimes see the Southern accent in general used as shorthand for a character that's undereducated or uneducated. And it's just my way of sort of chipping away at that belief or trying to chip away at that and show that, this isn't a way to categorize someone's intelligence by listening to the way that they speak, especially if it's something you being on the outside, not outside looking in and making a judgment call that this way of speaking is a sign of lower intelligence or lower education.
What's interesting to me in this too is that that this is obviously of a specific cultural group within the U.S., but that same thing exists like all across the U.S., especially for African American communities. I'm sure outside of the U.S. too, where there is this sense of like if you don't speak a certain type of English, you are uneducated, you're lower class, whatever the terms might be. And you made me think immediately of like conversations right now about AAVE, African American Vernacular English, and sometimes used other terms to describe it, and how there's this belief that, well, if you speak with this, like there's something wrong with you, you're not like proper American. And it seems like that's clearly a lot of what's happening here. So there's a lot of like interesting cultural linkages where you could take this in so many ways to think about these broader societal problems of how we talk about language and the cultural groups who speak them.
I love that you put it into a middle grade book, because this is not something that just affects adults, right? Like this is something that is affecting kids right now
Mm,
on a daily basis, right? Like the idea of respectability politics, that is still a conversation that is occurring within the United States. And furthermore, like as Sean pointed out to me, because I wasn't even thinking about this aspect, but the idea of class within this novel, where, you have private school kids versus public school kids. Obviously, most of this conversation is happening within the setting of the school in terms of the bullying that Jezebel is facing, but it's not just those class politics, it's also those that other black students look down on her for having and for living her culture,
yeah,
essentially.
yeah.
And so it's become erased to an extent in other students who she knows, go to her uncle for root work, and yet in public they are denying it for whatever reason. I think we know the reasons, but so can you talk about exploring that dynamic further?
Well, I feel like in writing a middle grade book, one of the things that I've had people tell me about root magic a couple of times that I was surprised about is they said that I don't talk down to the reader in root magic. And sometimes in books for children, things are too simplified or too, they baby the reader a little bit. And I wanted to introduce kids to the fact that there are people in the world who will say one thing and do another. And I use the phrase in the book that all skin folk ain't kinfolk, meaning just because someone looks like you doesn't mean they have the same ideas and the same beliefs as you. And I wanted to introduce that early because I think a lot of times when kids grow up, they grow up around their family, who a lot of times, not always in families, but a lot of times families tend to have similar beliefs in a household. And I wanted to get across that once you get outside of that household, you're going to encounter people that are very different from you. And being an innocent, let's use that phrase, you may go into situations thinking someone is on your side and believing them and believing what they say and what they tell you, when in reality they may be just telling you what you want to hear for a reason, or they want to be your friend when they're alone, but when they're around other kids, they don't want to be. And I wanted to just sort of introduce kids to the fact that that happens. And it's nothing that you've necessarily done. It's not you as a person. It's it's on them. And you have to realize, again, it's going back to that whole adjustment thing. You have to adjust your behavior because you certainly can't change theirs.
So something you were saying here about this idea that the way that you wanted to write for a younger audience, and not, you were not writing down to them, that you were telling a very honest way, exploring these issues in a very honest way, made me think immediately of the fact that you also have, understandably given the time period set in, police violence. And I don't want to spoil because it's pretty important to the book, as a major plot point for the book, but like very early on, there is just a moment when there's basically a police officer with no pretense whatsoever just ripping their house apart. And that's one of the opening settings of our book, of what's going on here. And it's, to me, it didn't seem that you were pulling many punches about it. And you gave complexity, right? There's another police officer who seems like he might be nicer, but there's that sense of like inherent distrust because of the way that this system works. And I feel like for me, like my immediate reaction was like, my gosh, how fascistic this is, what's happening. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about, what inspired you to really kind of explore this dynamic, pretty, I would say pretty brutally for a book that, like, I think a lot of people would just look, oh, it's a middle grade, like it's supposed to be like cutesy fun, like she's supposed to ride on a camel that talks, and like that's the story. But that's not, this is a story that, like, yes, it can be very playful, but it also is like, but we're talking about some very serious stuff here.
I absolutely can. I feel like there is this mentality that, like you said, kids' books have to be, oh, a talking camel or riding a talking camel and they're my best friend or something. And yes, those books are out there and they're absolutely valid and they're absolutely important because they need to show kids whimsy and joy, and all of that is incredibly important. And I also wanted to show in Root Magic, I wanted there to be joy, and I wanted there to be whimsy, and I wanted there to be awe and fascination and all of that. But I also wanted to show that we live in very complicated times, as Jez and Jay do in 1963, where Black kids, regardless of how young you are, if you're going off to school by yourself, you get sat down and you get told, this is the world that you live in, and this is how you have to act and function so that you get back here at the end of the day every day. And they have to learn that at a young age, and they have to grow up knowing that alongside of wanting to have fun and wanting to play. And that's something that Black kids are now taught as well. You're going out to school now. When you encounter a situation like this is how you have to respond. I wanted that to be something that I addressed and stated, because this is the way that a lot of kids live. And I don't know that everyone realizes that, but there is a section of the population that it's part of your growing up, that you learn how to be safe.
That's made me start thinking about how, in terms of tackling tough subjects, to an extent, that's not a thing that culturally we expect of white children, right? They get the giraffes that you ride around on. Was it a giraffe?
Camels.
Talking camels.
Talking camels.
The giraffes fly.
Oh,
right.
Course.
Okay.
But at the same time, as you say, there's just so many extra layers of complexity to what Black children face in this country, in terms of, sadly, things that you need to prepare them for. It sort of brings me weirdly to my next question, which was, you have some amazing authority figures in Root Magic. You have a Mrs. Connie, I think it is, the school
Corey.
nurse. Corey. I'm terrible at names, and Miss Watson,
Mm-hmm.
who are two amazing authority figures in Jezebel's life. And Miss Watson is, introducing African culture outside of Gullah Geechee heritage. She's introducing writers and music and poetry to her students, which was phenomenal. So I'm kind of curious, like, why was it important for you to show positive authority figures, first off? Where so often in middle grade especially, authority figures are seen as hostile figures.
I felt like it was important to show, especially a teacher, as a positive authority figure. My mother taught school for many, many years after she left social work, and I know firsthand from seeing the struggles that she went through to make sure that her kids got what they needed, even in light of the school district not providing everything all the time. The amount of times I went with her to the teacher supply store and she used her own money to buy things. And I know the teachers that sacrifice for their students. And I know that there are teachers that look at the curriculum and go, this isn't complete. This isn't everything. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it upon myself to add to the school's curriculum. And I think it's important to do that. And I think it's important to show that there are teachers that are willing to go above and beyond to make sure that kids get a fuller education. Because as we know, that It's impossible to teach absolutely everything in the classroom, but the things that have been taught are so narrow in scope a lot of times that they give kids a skewed view of the world. And Miss Watson coming in and saying, I want to show you something. How many of you are familiar with poetry? How many of you Black kids are familiar with Black poets? How many of you Black kids are familiar with prize winning Black poets? Well, I'm going to take my personal volume here and read to you today. And it's so important to have those reflections of self, because a lot of times learning history and all of that, you as Black people, or we as Black people, I should say, don't always see people that look like us touted as this is an amazing inventor, or this is an amazing scientist, or researcher, or whatever the case may be. You get some of it in February during Black History Month, but it isn't incorporated into US history as a normal part of learning about what's happened before.
Well, that's awesome, Eden.
Yeah,
Thank
it
you.
was-
We have to stop ourselves because
Okay, fine.
Jenna's going to ask like 18 more questions. But we do need to start the process of closing out. So, Eden, thank you so much for being here with us. Again, being on the show with us. We really appreciate it and letting us know about this book. And if you could, would you let folks know where they can find you and your things?
Absolutely. It was a pleasure, as always, to be on the show with you guys. You can find me. I have a website, which is EdenRoyce.com. I am on Twitter at EdenRoyce. I have an Instagram account, which I'm not great at updating, but I'm trying to do better. And that is at Eden Royce Books on Instagram.
Again, from me personally, thank you so much, Eden, for being here. And otherwise, that's it for today, listeners. If you'd like to let us know what you thought about this episode, head on over to skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. Also, follow us at Skiffy and Fanty on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our newsletter at skiffyandfanty.com/newsletter. Finally, if you like what we do, please support us at patreon.com/skiffyandfanty and give us some love by leaving a 5-star review on iTunes, even if all you say is yogurt. You can find me at loopdeloo on Twitter and Patreon.
And you can find me at Sean Duke or patreon.com/thejoyfactory.
And that's all we wrote. Sean, would you like to make it awkward today, or can we skip that mess?
I always have to make the ending of the main episodes awkward, Jen. That is a requirement by law. Sorry, for those that don't know, it's the newest amendment to the Constitution, what they did in secret, involving the CIA, a talking camel, and in fact a goat who has lasers for eyes, which is a wild thing, but is in fact very true. His name is Phil. So,
if only they would make some good amendments to the Constitution, this world might be a better place.
No
and
kidding.
With that,
awkward
bye
ending.
everybody.
And see. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.